Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just waiting for a few people further to come in. We're booked in for a spectacular 559 people today. I'm not expecting all of them, shockingly enough, but we're going to wait probably until a minute or two past 2 o'clock, sorry, before we kick off. You'll see that you've got the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen. If you can pop your questions in there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to address those at the end of the event, because I'm sure you will ask some questions that are addressed in the slides, and so I'd rather do it that way round. And of course, if someone has already asked your question, feel free to ask it again if you would like, but obviously if your question is already on the list, then we'll hopefully get to it regardless of whether it's asked twice or not. We've also managed to activate subtitling for the presentation this week. Hopefully it will work. It's not the world's most reliable setup though, so if it misrepresents what I'm saying, I'm very sorry. You'll have to blame Microsoft for that one. It's an imperfect technology, but we think it's a little bit helpful on the whole. I'm hoping that my colleagues Will and Rohan are going to join me. So we're going to be waiting for them for a couple of minutes, as I said. And yeah, thank you very much.
Hi Matt, I can't show my video again, and you're muted.
That should let you have your video now, Will. Is that working for you?
Let's have a looky. Yep, here I am. Oh, you've gone again.
You're looking very handsome. How are you this afternoon?
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you.
Excellent.
I've got my headphones in because Amber was doing an overnight shift at the hospital, so she's trying to sleep, so I don't want to disturb her too much.
Very considerate of you. Rohan's stuck outside, so I'm just going to invite him in.
Okay.
And we've got impressive numbers already. 103 we're up to, and that'll hopefully creep up. I'm not expecting the full 559 that the pre-screen suggested.
Yeah, I think our Q&A would end up being quite long.
Yeah, if anything, it's a relief. I think that will be too many people, eager as we are to talk to everyone. Ah, here's Rohan. He's just come in. All right, and he's vanished again. Well, I'll keep waiting for him to show up, and then we'll get things going after that.
Fair.
Rohan, can you hear us now?
Absolutely.
Oh wow! You not only have you done your hair, you've got glasses today. This is novel. I'm not sure I've seen you in those before.
I'm full of surprises, Matt.
Wow, I'd say you look just like your father, but I don't imagine that's the kind of feedback you're hoping for. Fab. We've still got people ticking through the attending box. I'm going to give that another minute or so, and then we'll get going. But we're holding steady at over 100, which is very exciting. Although they're dipping back down again, I shouldn't have said that. Clearly people are losing interest already. No, that should be fine. Right, well, we seem to have leveled off just there, somewhere between 115 and 120, which is pretty impressive. So I think we'll go ahead with that lineup. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Obviously, thanks to the law, you don't really have anywhere else to be, but we're very grateful nevertheless that you're choosing to spend some of your ample time indoors with us. It's really gratifying to see how many people are interested in the services we're able to provide. So to kick things off, I thought I would introduce everyone. So if you are both ready, Will, you certainly look ready. Rohan, he looks like he's turned his video off. Yep. We'll start moving on that front. So Will, if you'd like to go first, tell us who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the head of consulting here at UniAdmissions. I spend most of my time speaking with students, speaking with parents, learning about their applications, and giving them advice based on what they tell me. So obviously, if different students will come to me with very, very different situations and backgrounds, and of course, the route to take following that will naturally vary a lot as well. I'm an Oxford grad myself, so Oxford specific questions I should be able to answer very well. Rohan and Matt usually do the more Cambridge side of things because that's their background. But yeah, that's me.
Fantastic. And Rohan, if you'd like to tell us who you are.
So, hi everyone, my name is Rohan. I'm the founder of UniAdmissions. I started this journey for everyone in the company 7 years ago. You may have seen my name on a few of the books that your children have been reading. And essentially my role here is to ensure that our success rates continue improving year after year. So last year we got 2/3 of our students in. This year we're aiming for a much higher number. And the eventual aim for UniAdmissions is to get 100% of our students successfully into Oxbridge and medical schools across the UK.
Yep, it's a big goal. My name is Matt. I look after our research team here at UniAdmissions. My job is to make sure that all of the advice, the products, the books, everything that we put out there to you is based on real evidence of what actually works when it comes to getting into Oxford or medical school, and that we're revising and updating and refining that approach year on year so that everything we do is stuff that works, stuff that we can measure, and stuff that we know provides a real value add for you and for the students and for everyone involved. So to kick things off, if you're keen to speak to us directly, which is honestly the easiest way to have a lot of your questions answered, which is to say you'll probably have a complex and nuanced question about your son or your daughter and their particular circumstances, and on a call with 124 other people, it isn't practical for us to answer that question in the detail it deserves. If you visit the UniAdmissions website, you'll be able to book a consultation. There's a little GIF I've put together at the very end of the presentation showing you how in exhaustive detail. And if you do that, then you'll be able to speak to Will or Rohan or one of the other members of the team, and they'll be able to give you some really detailed, specific advice of the kind that for reasons of scale, we can't practically provide on a call with so many people. So hopefully we'll answer a lot of your questions in this call, but if you have any questions that are a little too subtle, this is the best way to get in touch with us. We also know that some of you joining us on this call will be planning ahead, something which I am strongly in favour of. And that means that your son or daughter or someone else in your life maybe even yourself, is planning to apply to Oxford or Cambridge or medical school, to start not in the coming September, but after that. So I wanted to just highlight the range of things we have available for students who are planning fully in advance rather than jumping in now to try and do something about their interviews in the next few weeks. So Will, if you could talk us through a little bit about our classic program, so to speak.
Yeah, so like I was saying earlier, it really depends on what you ought to be doing, depending on what stage you're at. And that's why we like to speak with all of our students before, before working with them and supporting them. But obviously for students in year 12, they've got about, just over 12 months before their interview, which is, quite a considerable amount of time that you can use effectively. And naturally, we'd want you to be doing something very different to a year 13 student who's obviously got lots of different priorities at the moment, and certain parts of the application have been completed already. So this is taken from one of the pages on our website. We expect our students to work quite hard. We don't really think there's any quick fix for the whole application itself. It does take hard work, consistent work, ideally for as long as you're able to do it. And yeah, using these 12, 13 months effectively is really important. It will vary a bit depending on the individual, but generally the kind of long-term support that we do will consist of, a significant amount of materials. We write lots and lots of textbooks, as some of you will have seen already. We also develop online test platforms, our own specimen papers, all these different things so that students can be working on it. They'll also be spending time with a tutor. So you can see that's the second part just there. One option could be to have 2 tutorials a week for a whole year, but ultimately we want the students to be driving this a lot. We don't want them to be overwhelmed by tutor time. We want it to be self-driven and not like a spoon-feeding exercise. And with the guidance and advice and teaching from the tutor through the year, on a sort of, if you were to start now, you do about 1 every fortnight. And that gives you lots and lots of time in your own time to be working through the things that they've been talking with you about, doing your homework that you're set, those kind of things. There's a huge amount of stuff that students will be getting on board with. We run weekly enrichment seminars specific to subject groups. So all our students are going to weekly university level lectures to help them explore their subject, push them above their A-level syllabus. And yeah, I suppose overall 180 hours does sound like a lot. And for some students it will be. But if you work consistently, if you work hard, that's a few hours a week. And generally speaking, for people who are serious about applying to Oxford or Cambridge, that shouldn't be, that shouldn't be an enormous ask. And obviously, you'll be grateful for it once you're on the other side of things.
Thanks very much, Will. So the plan is we're going to spend just a couple more minutes on talking about forward planning, and then we're going to spend the rest of the session on students who have more immediate pressing needs. But Rohan, if you could talk us very briefly through the Head Start program for students who are planning even further ahead.
Yeah, so the Head Start program is really designed for students coming to us in year 10 and 11. This is kind of essentially the way to maximize a student's chances of success. So in our experience, the earlier the student starts working with us, or just generally preparing on their application, the more likely they are to get an interview. Our experience, the more likely they are to succeed and see a very competitive applications. The way the Head Start program works is generally students who join it don't have a good understanding of the subject. Some do, but a lot of the time they're kind of torn between 2 or 3 subjects. Essentially, it's a program where we put them through the paces, and they'll have 1 session with a subject specialist every month. We'll work on essentially building their profile, so gaining work experience and giving them extra skills they need, things to put down on their personal statement when it finally comes to putting in their application. So it's a much more gentler program. It's a lot less time intensive, but actually what it allows us to do is to start thinking early, start planning, because sometimes what happens is we get students who are, for instance, applying for medicine, yet they haven't got any work experience. Obviously, that's a big no-no as far as a competitive medical application goes. So a Head Start program essentially allows us to start working with the student on a much earlier basis and actually optimizing things in advance. So as far as I know, we've not had a single Head Start student not get in at least an interview at the university. So it does work. Obviously, it's a much bigger commitment because they have to work with us for a longer period of time. But as a result, it's successful.
Fantastic. For those of you who are joining us with applying next September, October, or even the following year in mind, we're going to be doing a full session on these topics in 2 weeks, 2 weeks today, in the same time slot. So if you're planning in advance like that, then that's the best time to join us. You're more than welcome to stay for the rest of the session, which is going to be about interview preparation for students who are applying literally right now. But that's all we're going to do in terms of covering longer term planning for the time being. So you're welcome to stick around, but any detailed questions about applications next year, you'll be best off joining us in 2 weeks' time again, when we'll be able to give that a lot more detail and time and consideration. So sticking with 2020, as I just said, to talk you through a few of our highlights as a business this year, and Rohan will be able to update me on these numbers because I've forgotten to change the slide again. We've worked with over 250 students this year. I imagine it's well over 300, maybe even 350 by now.
Yeah, it's touching 300. There
we are. Over 1,300 tutors, I imagine, getting close to 1,500 there. And I'm sure that 6,000 odd hours has been blown out of the water by now, thanks to the admissions tests and we have the interview day running at this very moment, which I know is going to clock through at least 500 hours on its own. So those hours of study are, well, spectacular at this point in time. I'd have to check with Barbara, but I was in with the interview prep day this morning, and there were an awful lot of them in that first session. Very exciting. So we pride ourselves, among other things, on our tutor to student ratio, where we will often work with up to 3 or 4 tutors for each student, which we don't believe any other school or company can really compete with, as well as the depth of work we're able to offer our students, where they have essentially an almost unlimited amount of material to work on that we're able to provide them with. The 180 hours Will talked about earlier, if you want more than that, we can certainly provide it. There's really no upper limit on how much preparation we can do if that's what you're into. We're also really proud to have a charitable arm, which we call UniAdmissions Foundation. We've worked with an additional 93 students in 2020, which is very, very close to our target of 100, which we're really proud of. And our target for 2022 is for us to be matching 1-to-1. So for every student who comes to work with us on a paid-for basis, that we're able to match them with another student who we're able to work with on a charitable basis. These are students who are from deprived backgrounds, from areas of low access to higher education, free school meals, you know, the kind of people that Marcus Rashford is always so keen on. And we like to do our little bit as well. Not as good on the football field, but we'd like to think at least as good in the university field. The part of the business that I spend the most time on is our research, which I talked about earlier, which is to say making sure that what we do actually works rather than just seeming fun or pretty or looking impressive. So among those things this year, we weren't able to attend any of the Oxford or Cambridge Open Days, which was a big disappointment. Always a highlight of my year, but no one else was allowed to go, so that was some comfort, I suppose. But we were able to persist through those, and we spent nearly a week on Zoom making sure that we were up to date with everything that was being discussed at Oxford and Cambridge in terms of the admissions process, and that all of our information was absolutely up to date. We've been able to open up exciting new sources of freedom of information data, which I'm going to show you in a moment, which allow us to give a really detailed picture to our customers of their child's position. We've been able to update all of our resources in line with the admissions test changes. You'll have read about the various difficulties that there were administering those a couple of weeks ago, but rest assured, if your children were working with us, they'll have had the most up-to-date resources the right question formats, the right numbers of questions, the right difficulty, all of those things to revise from, even if the test itself didn't load properly. And we've been working hard to make sure that we've been able to provide targeted help for computer-based exams and the new computer-based interviews. I spent an hour this morning talking to our students about how best to present themselves on Zoom. So if you have any constructive feedback on whether I'm coming across nicely or not, please do let me know so I can incorporate that into the next session. Maybe I've done something wrong that I hadn't spotted. So as an example of our freedom of information research, we've been able to find out the average number of GCSEs for each subject at Cambridge and to split that by offer and by place. So this is for offer. So this gives us a really good sense of which students will be competitive for admission, and means that when we talk to parents, we can give them a factual basis for our recommendations. So if you come to us and say, I really want to study, let's say, law at Cambridge, but I'm worried I haven't got the GCSE results, we can say to you, well, this is the average. As long as you're within a sensible range of this, you should be fine. To be able to provide that reassurance on a factual basis, which I think is really valuable. We've also been able to pull out some fun little video clips. This is a favourite of mine, which I like to play as a source of reassurance for parents who are worried that their child has been stuck indoors all year and so hasn't been able to do their Duke of Edinburgh.
I suppose if you are extremely interested and excited by things that are not related to the subject of English, like sport or music or something like that, that's great. But we're probably not that interested actually in that element of your well-rounded self.
This is my favourite part of every presentation. Parents often come in with the expectation, I think led by American universities, that unless you've founded a startup and raised $1 million for charity or any of these other things, that you can't get into the top universities. The truth at Cambridge and Oxford as well is that they want you to be good at maths or English or biology. And honestly, they don't care about any of these other things, which leads us nicely onto Rohan's favourite part of the presentation, which is the pie chart. Rohan, tell us about the pie chart.
The infamous pie chart. Thanks, Matt. So often we get students and parents coming to us and a little bit confused as to how exactly their application is weighted. The first thing to say is this pie chart is a general approximation based on our years of experience and the data we've got available, and it works in the majority of times. However, if you're applying for certain courses, which we'll talk about, it may not be an exact approximation. So to get started, essentially we call it as the rule of threes. So essentially you can think of your application in three major chunks. The first chunk is your GCSE grades or equivalent. The second chunk is your admissions test scores. The final bit is your interview score. Now, each of those weigh approximately 30%. The other 10%, you're probably wondering, well, that's everything else. What do I mean by that? Well, that's your personal statement, your school reference, any intangibles mentioned in the personal statement itself, any extra reading and so on. So essentially, it doesn't, what you can hopefully see very quickly is, even if you've done your GCSEs, the most important two things that are relevant for your application are the test scores and interviews. And it's unsurprising that the majority of our work with students is done exactly those components. Obviously, there are exceptions to this. So for instance, if you're applying for biology at Oxford or a course that doesn't require an admissions test, like geography, for instance, then obviously the admissions test component isn't important as much. But this is a general approximation. It's true. If you're applying as a year 10 or 11, it's therefore even more important that you do particularly well in your GCSEs.
Thanks, Rohan. And the thing to remember about the pie chart as well is that if you're planning to apply next year or even the year after, you still have very nearly the whole of this pie chart under your control. And if you're expecting an interview or you've already had an interview invitation, then not only have you got most of the pie chart right because you've got to the final stage, but you also have the interview still well within your control. So the thing to bear in mind is, although this can seem a little bit daunting, you have more control over it than you might necessarily expect. One of the resources we're excited to share as well with our students is the newly revised edition of the Oxbridge Interview Guide. If you decide not to come and work with us this year, given the short notice relative to the interviews or any other factors, we do strongly recommend our book, which we would say, but I have read the whole thing. And it is very helpful, and this is based on our work with hundreds of students over the years. And I believe it's either me or Toby is going to have the unenviable task of updating it in January with all of the new things we've learned this year, which will be very helpful for everyone else. But will mean I'll have to read it again, which I think at the fourth time won't necessarily be as fun as I found it last time. And that covers all subjects. And we also have, I believe, a couple of more specialised books around medicine as well, because I've seen that just pop in. We still have a medicine interview book, don't we, Rohan?
Yeah, so for students enrolling onto the programs, there's an extra medical interview section.
There you are. We've got absolutely loads of books, so that's one thing you're not going to find a shortage of if you come and get involved with our work. So in terms of the interviews this year, we want to answer a few common questions. The first one, obviously, and for those of you who've joined us over the last few weeks, some of this material will be familiar. Will you be invited for an interview? The short answer is the interview invitations have started going out, so you may already know. If you have received an interview invitation, then the answer is yes. You will be invited to interview. You have been. Your chance of getting an interview vary depending on the course and university you've selected. So Oxford generally interview fewer people than Cambridge, but that varies a lot by subject. So they interview pretty much everyone who applies for chemistry, whereas computer science, it's only around 11–12% of people. And one of the reasons for this is there isn't a test for chemistry, but there is for computer science. And so that's an important factor in understanding how the selection process goes on. The other big difference is that Cambridge will interview almost everyone who applies for medicine at Cambridge, whereas Oxford will only interview around a quarter of applicants. So if you do find that you've got an interview at Cambridge, that's excellent news, but you've still got fairly stiff competition ahead of you. Whereas at Oxford, the odds have very much narrowed in your favour if you've got that interview. Although, of course, you are still competing with, unfortunately, the best candidates, which doesn't make your job any easier than it would otherwise be. Now, I'm going to cite throughout this every now and again bits of data about Oxford interviews. Unfortunately, Cambridge don't provide any information about this, no matter how many times I ask. As they interview upwards of 70% of applicants for most courses, and some very nearly 100%, and so they won't tell us. I keep asking, and they keep saying no. It's frustrating, but unfortunately that's the case. If you have any particular queries about interview chances, those are one of the things that's best to set up a consultation with us for the simple reason that I can't do the PowerPoint and get the Excel sheet out at the same time. But those are a quick and easy query to sort out over the phone if you want to get in touch with us directly. So the interviews themselves, if you've been lucky enough to get an interview, which you should hopefully either have heard about already or be hearing about next week, how's it going to work? So we know that all of them are taking place online, with the exception, surprisingly, of some students in Hong Kong and Singapore who are being interviewed in person, creating the slightly surreal situation where if you're in Peterborough, you can't be interviewed in person, but if you are in Macau, you can be. It's a little odd, but that's the way it's rolled out this year, thanks to the virus. Oxford are doing this over Microsoft Teams, whereas Cambridge are using Zoom and a platform called Whereby, which I have less experience with, but I understand works on a very similar basis. And that's more to do with the stylus and other graph type questions they're using that. Oxford have already told us when the interviews are. They start on December the 7th, which is 2 weeks on Monday, and they run for the following 2 weeks, up until what would normally be the Christmas break. And Cambridge interviews are running almost perfectly in parallel with Oxford. There may be a little bit of a dip either side, but that's not something we've had detailed information on. We know that Cambridge are sending out their at-interview assessments like the Cambridge Law Test on Monday. And so we expect that the interviews will be running as per Oxford from the beginning of December, maybe a touch earlier. We'll let you know, but chances are you'll know before us if you're expecting an invitation, as that'll have more detail than they're giving us at present. And if you're applying for medicine outside of Oxford or Cambridge, then those interviews will be starting from the end of November and running all the way through until March. Given the difficulties with the Bmat there have been this year, we would not be shocked if these interviews end up being pushed until more after Christmas than before, But I'm sure, Rohan, have you heard anything on this?
As far as we know, the interview dates have kind of what been announced, but as you say, Matt, we'll probably find out a little bit more about the real picture in a week or two. It depends on how smoothly these go, I suppose.
Yes, yeah. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this goes for Oxford and Cambridge in the first few days, to see how they deal with the teething problem. So any advice we give you later on about presenting yourself well on Zoom, I think is going to be even more valuable if it turns out your interview is on the morning of the first day, as the chance of the person at the other end of the computer knowing what they're doing are even slimmer than they would be normally. So how do the interviews themselves work beyond the technical questions we've just addressed? Now, you'll hear a lot of urban myths about the interviews, but they are far more structured and strict than you might think. This is because the universities have put a huge effort in recent years into making the process fairer and more transparent. That means that every interview is graded on the same day by both interviewers. Sometimes there'll be 3 interviewers. Those grades are then audited between the interviewers. Everything is looked after internally. People rotate round to keep an eye on each other to make sure everything's being done consistently. And all of that is entered into the computer system on the same day. So there's a very strict system in terms of making sure that everyone's being given a fair crack of the whip when it comes to the interview. You'll have heard the urban myths, I'm sure, where they'll ask you, you walk into the interview and they ask you a bizarre question like, why are bananas straight? Or tell me a clever joke, or something silly like that, or ask you an obtuse question about bears or manhole covers. Now, while this may have been the case when Rohan and I applied, it didn't happen to either of us. And that was nearly 15 years ago in my case. That was something that did happen back then with older members of staff who were used to the old system. It simply doesn't happen anymore. What you will be asked will be a sensible, reasonable question about your subject. They might ask you something a little unusual as you get towards the end of your interview, as Rohan will tell you about, but it will only ever be in a sensible context. No one's going to ask you why a banana is straight, as I said. Because you had an experience like this yourself, I remember you telling me, Rohan.
Yeah, there were quite a few. I think if it's really easy to take some of these questions out of context and make them sound absurd. And, the media kind of love perpetuating this. So those of you who read the broadsheets, there will kind of be things like, how many ping pong balls can you fit in a jumbo jet, and those kind of questions. And it's important to know that they take the interview builds up to that question. So one of the ones in my interview was actually, how is DNA like sheet music? Now, the only reason that eventually emerged towards the end of the interview was because my entire interview was based on the structure of DNA, and then he happened to know that I was a musician. So the ability to compare and contrast was actually really, really pivotal. But it would be very unfair to kind of ask me that straight up as a first question. And that's what you have to not get fooled into, is everything will be building up to an overall puzzle, which you can answer rather than kind of just being thrown at you.
Didn't know you were a musician, Rohan.
There's a lot you don't know, Matt.
Clearly. I can't say I'm shocked, but, to hide that from me. So to talk a little
band together for Christmas, perhaps.
So to talk a little bit about the interviews themselves, what are they looking for when it comes to the interview? So these are 3 key points that I've taken from the specification for the law interviews, just to give you an example. So things that they pull out are applications, so that you show that you're concentrated, that you're enthusiastic, you're passionate, and that when you're faced with a problem like the difficulty of the jumbo jet and the ping pong balls, you're really interested in figuring it out, and that you really pursue it. That you're reasoning, that you're reacting thoughtfully, you're taking in new information and incorporating it in a sensible way, that your line of reasoning makes sense, that you're not contradicting yourself, and that if you find that the line of argument you've been trying out isn't working for you, that you switch over to something else, that you don't get stuck in something stubborn and unproductive. And finally, to make sure that you're communicating well, that what you say is clear, that you articulate it carefully, and that they can understand what you're talking about. And that isn't to say that you need to be using flowery language or anything like that, but to make sure that in that conversation, you're demonstrating, just how well reasoned and how passionate you are, and that you're putting that across clearly, rather than trying to show off or becoming stubborn and difficult to work with. Now, all of this is different because, of course, you would have previously expected to be doing this in a beautiful medieval building and over an oak table in a book-lined room. But unfortunately, everyone's going to be doing it probably at home. So unless you have a particularly palatial residence, the setting isn't going to be as nice as it would otherwise have been, because all of this is happening, as we said, on Zooms and on Teams. Now, I've done a presentation this morning for some of our students, giving them slightly more detailed advice, but to sort of go through the highlights here. And I hope that I'm, doing some of these things as well, setting a good example. We recommend making sure that you look into the camera, not into the screen, so that it feels like you're making eye contact with the tutor. This is really helpful in terms of building a rapport with them, which is obviously much more difficult over the computer. We find it's really helpful to dress properly. No one will be able to see your trousers, but that's no reason not to wear them. Maybe try out wearing some shoes. Really present yourself as if it was the real interview and take it as seriously as that. And that comes down to making sure you've dressed properly. The other thing is not to rush. You're going to have slightly more leeway in terms of time than you would in the physical interview. So take a breath, make sure you have a glass of water with you, be clear and articulate and relaxed as best you can. And this is even more difficult over Zoom because you don't have any of the physical cues you normally would do. Given that you don't have that, feel free to emphasize your emotions a little bit. You can be a little bit bolder, smile a little bit bigger, push your eyes a little bit wider, overdo things a tiny bit to compensate for the fact that you're basically just ahead. And so if you want to come across as enthusiastic, you may have to overdo it a tiny bit. But that's something for you to practice and try out for yourself, really. And the other thing to make sure, and this feels very obvious, but even in Zoom calls with all sorts of people in recent months, I've noticed people missing this one. Make sure they can see you properly. So do test how you set up your room. Make sure you're lit from the front. Make sure there isn't anything weird and distracting in the background. Make sure people can see what you're doing. It makes a huge difference, and it's something I've put a lot of effort into. I've got a special light. So hopefully that's paying off for you watching. And that's one of our most important tips for these Zoom interviews. Our expectation is that the interviewers will be less comfortable with the software than you. So this is a really good opportunity for you to look slick and professional and come across really well. So that sort of gives you a sense of the work we do, the preparation and advice and insight we try to provide. But obviously our help is much more detailed and specific than that. So what can we do to help if you've got an interview coming up in 2 weeks' time, for example? So Will, if you could talk us through the focused interview program.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've got a slide. So as Matt's been, Matt and Rohan have been alluding to, our students are doing interviews preparation as we speak. So, that they're sort of making the most of these last few weeks before their actual interview, before they'll be, either speaking with some professors from Oxford or professors from Cambridge. Now, what we like to do is make sure that they're working on a few different things over these next few weeks. Very rarely is one approach the best approach. So we like to, and you'll notice this with all our programs, we'd like to support students in a number of different ways. And one clear example here is the split between one-to-one learning and group learning. So you see the first two things there, the mock interviews and the hours of interview tutorials, those are all one-to-one. So we'll pair you up with subject-specific tutors. You'll be able to focus on the things which you struggle with most personally, and you'll be able to develop through practice and revision with your mock interviewers and with your personal tutor. But as well as this, we like to do group work because we find that it's very helpful to be able to learn collaboratively, to be able to learn from others' mistakes, learn from what other people are doing well, and to be able to pay attention to that. So in the intensive interview course, which is running today and tomorrow, there's one next weekend, the weekend after that, students will be working in small groups discussing interview questions and topics, but also they'll be watching other students doing mock interviews. It's really important in that scenario to be able to think critically, to be able to make comments about what comes off well, what maybe doesn't, and then to use that introspectively and consider, are these things that I'm doing myself? If they're not so good, should I think about trying to avoid that? One of the things that students really struggle with is this whole taking your time concept. It's really easy as a tutor to say, take a breath, don't feel like you have to answer straight away. But, having been through the interview process myself, I know that it feels like any gap is far, far too long. So it can be very helpful to see other people doing a mock interview and to notice, okay, actually, they paused before the question, they waited a few before answering, they waited a few seconds, and then came out with their thoughts on the topic. And actually, it didn't look like they didn't know what they were doing. It looked like they were on top of things. So maybe pausing isn't such a bad thing. Maybe I don't have to rush into saying the first thing that pops into my head. And that's just one example of how actually watching others can be a really good way to learn. So students at the moment doing those day courses, working one-to-one with their tutors, and of course working outside of that. Practicing in front of a mirror, practicing on Zoom, and recording yourself. These are all really helpful things to be doing, and our students will have the books, the materials, to make sure that when they are doing stuff in their own time, they're using that time effectively, and they know where to be working and how to be improving, basically. That's the most typical support that we're doing at the moment. Again, it may vary depending on if you've never done an interview in your life, or if you've done 3 Oxbridge interviews already. Although if you've done 3 and haven't gotten in, then maybe that might need some more preparation. These things are always multifactorial.
Thanks, Will. We've shown you the slide there for our medicine support, but we have support available for pretty much every subject. We just don't have the graphics for them. So I can show you the graphic for the economics program as well. But rest assured, they're available for law, for English, for really anything you could want. And Rohan or Will, up to you. The question we normally get at this point is to find out about cost. Is that something you'd be happy to talk about, Rohan?
Yeah, so the overall investment really varies depending on the student. If you're coming to us for the full program or Head Start, obviously we need to ensure that you're a good fit, and that's why we need to speak to every single student. So regardless of what you're trying to book with UniAdmissions, we won't accept students who we've not spoken to before. So that's why you're not able to book anything through the website. And there's a very strong reason for that is ultimately we have to protect our success rates. So we're very proud of our numbers, and we work very hard. And I work very hard to make sure that they stay as high as possible. So last year we got 2/3 of our students in. That inevitably requires us to be selective. So basic things like we have to be relatively picky with the number of students we work with. We have to be picky with their GCSE grades. So if you've got less than 6 A stars, for instance, without extenuating circumstances, it's unlikely we would work with you. It makes your chances of getting an interview or an offer very, very low. There are, of course, exceptions, and this is why it's important you come to speak to us. But what we tend to say is anyone looking to book a substantial program, so anything like the full program with us or a Head Start, we need to speak to you. Even for interview support, it may not be a full assessment and consultation, but it's still a process, and we still need to speak to not just the parent, but also the student. So, some parents contact and say, can I have one mock interview for my child? The answer is almost always no. Until we've spoken to your son or daughter, we don't have a good understanding of what they need. So there are some cases where actually students come to us and we say, actually, they don't need our help. They're doing fine as they are. But until we do that, we can't make an assessment. Generally, we only offer to work with about 30% of students. In some cases, we say actually they're not a good fit. In some cases, we say they don't need our help. In some cases, we think that actually, yeah, it could work. General pricing wise, the focus programs really depend on exactly your requirements. You may not need all 3 or 4 components of it. You may only need 1, but they start from £795. But that is, of course, the guide price. If you are from a widening access participation background, from an underprivileged background, please do get in touch with us. We have generous full bursaries available, so don't let cost be a barrier to getting support. So that should, don't worry about the money. What I tend to say is parents ask for the overall investment. It could be, well, it could be as low as £0.
Thanks, Rohan. That's really helpful to sort of give a taste of how that kind of scales up and down, I think. And it's a question we always get during these, so I'm glad we've been able to address that relatively early on. So looking at those sort of 4 core elements, 4 hours tuition, that sort of explains itself, as do the mock interviews. The intensive course, that's happening, our first edition of that is happening at this very moment, and that's repeating next weekend and the following weekend. So that's something we'll be able to speak to you about in more detail once you get in contact with us. But Will, we'll be able to tell us a little bit about the enrichment seminars, as this is sort of more of our secret sauce, really, something that sets us apart from other providers.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, these are very much there for students to engage with, explore, make the most of. Through the year, we run these, I mentioned this earlier, these weekly enrichment seminars. And they're separated off between subject groups. So there's one for medicine, for humanities, for economics, for STEM, for law. Naturally, some subjects span those. So if you're a PPE applicant, you'd be going to the economics and the humanities ones. You know, if you're a NatSci student, you might be going to the medical ones and the STEM ones. So yes, so we break them off into these subject streams. And they're designed by our tutors to cover a huge range of university level topics. So to give you an example from STEM, you know, one week they might be discussing artificial intelligence, the next they might be discussing nuclear power, the next they might be discussing probability, statistics and risk. You know, there's lots of different things across maths, physics, engineering, which students might have lots and lots of interest in. Some topics you might not be as interested in. You know, you might say artificial intelligence, I really don't care about that. I'm much more interested in the more practical engineering side of things, and that's fine. You know, the point of having a broad syllabus is that there will be something which you can engage with and you find interesting. The point of these, it's not a matter of, you know, I think people often misunderstand the point of reading lists. And you can sort of see this as a reading list, except slightly more interactive. When Oxford Maths sets a reading list, it's not a matter of if you read all these books, you will then be a good Oxbridge applicant. It's really, I often say that reading a lot of books is a side effect of being a good Oxbridge applicant, not the main goal. Okay. So you should want to read about different topics. You should want to explore things more and more. It can be difficult to find topics. It can be difficult to know what you're interested in. And then these seminars are perfect. So you might go to the crisis seminar if you're a humanities student, and you might think, actually, I didn't enjoy that. I didn't find that interesting. But you might go to the aesthetics one the following week and think that was really interesting. And then you do the further reading, the pre-reading, all these other things to develop it as something that you're interested in and you also know a lot about. So yeah, at the moment, our interview students, obviously there's only a few weeks. Well, I think there's 3 or 4 live seminars. So they run on Sunday afternoons at 2 o'clock. There's about 3 or 4 live left, but all of our students have access to the whole archive from the year. So you have an enormous library of learning materials to use. And like I say, every single seminar comes with pre-reading, further reading suggestions as well.
Fantastic, thanks, Will. The enrichment seminars are one of my favourite parts of the process, because it's something that I've always felt is a little bit lacking in the kind of traditional approach. It's so easy to give people lots of tests and interview prep, but once you get into the actual experience of being at Oxford, having had a little bit of practice like this to develop your ideas and really get a sense of what it'll be like, is really helpful, not just for being successful in your degree, but also making sure you get the right subject in the first place. Because I know a lot of our students have spent a few weeks on one of these and then realised they don't want to be an economist after all. And that's really valuable to find out before you apply rather than afterwards, as the last thing you want is to decide that you want to become an economist the day after you send your UCAS application. It's too late to change your mind. So this all sort of leads up to the impact we have on our students, which I think Will has sort of alluded to there. Now it varies between courses, because of course we have different levels of demand for each course. Each course has a different level of competition. So there's a little bit of variation, but in the aggregate, we're able to achieve success for 63, nearly 2/3 of our students in the last cycle. And we're working on improving the quality of our data on this as well. We've recently submitted our, in fact, it was on Monday, I think I did it. We submitted our data set to UCAS themselves to have all of our data verified and matched, so that we can guarantee that this is a real number rather than something we've massaged for the marketing materials. And that's by contrast with not even 20% in terms of the national average. And even if you go and look at some of the top schools, even Eton, they struggle to get in more than 35, 40%. So the value add we're able to provide is something we're really proud of. Our reviews are very nice. I know controversially last week, and I haven't changed these slides, someone said something nice about Mia, but nothing nice about Will. I should have changed that really, but I wasn't feeling very generous spirited. Obviously you can find dozens more like these on Trustpilot, but I like to pull a few out just to give you a flavour of them, and obviously to irritate Will that no one has anything nice to say about him. On Trustpilot at least, I'm sure. I'm sure his girlfriend who he's having to be quiet for this afternoon after she got back from hospital is being perfectly nice to him.
I don't need my ego massage, don't worry, Matt, I'll be fine.
Oh, you're so quick to deny it. And that sort of brings us to the end of the structured part of this, which is to say I've run out of slides. So we're going to swap over to questions. We've already had 39 questions, and I know that Will and Rohan have been working hard to answer some of those directly in the chat while I've been, talking all this time. But we're going to sort of throw those open now and go through those. We probably won't be able to answer all of them, particularly if the number keeps going up. So if your question doesn't get answered, please don't take it personally. It will probably be for one of two reasons. One, your question is quite complicated and specific to you, and so we'll need to speak to you directly to be able to give you a sensible answer. Or it's something that we have covered in the presentation already, and if you asked it before we got to that bit, but we've answered it since, we'll try and avoid answering it again in the interest of getting to the now 42 open, 43 open questions. Again, if you want to get in touch with us to have further questions answered, to book something with us, or really anything else, the best thing to do is to book a consultation, which you can do hopefully using this snazzy GIF I've created, which should now on a loop show you how to do it for the next 20 minutes. Rohan was very keen on this idea, so we'll see if it works properly. A little low resolution, but that's unfortunately a side effect of it looping for a complicated technical standard reason that I had to deal with this morning. But let's kick off the questions. Rohan, have you picked one out that you like the look of?
Well, there's lots of questions on the seminars, particularly the logistics of them. So to clarify this, the enrichment seminars have been taking place since April now. They take place at 2 o'clock every Sunday, and that's UK time. The seminars take place in a group setting. The individual tuition and the mock interviews are in a one-to-one setting. The seminars are all recorded and they're stored in our archives. And if a student enrolls onto the program, then they have access to the entire archive for the whole year. The medics in particular, they get access to the seminars until March 2021, because obviously their interview season doesn't finish just with Oxbridge. They also have their standard other medical interviews to go to. If you're unable to attend, or you live in a time zone where actually that may be particularly difficult, then the archives and recordings are available for you.
Fab. Thanks, Rohan. We've had a few questions about doing the interview from home. So this is something I talked about this morning with our students. Our official advice is, if you have the choice of doing your interview from at home or from school, we recommend finding out where the best Wi-Fi is and where you're least likely to be interrupted and doing it there. Schools should be fairly flexible about this. bear in mind that if you do get into Cambridge or Oxford, chances are they're going to put your photo on the front of the school website next year. And so you can probably be a little bit demanding of them to find you a computer lab if you don't want to do it from home. That will be our advice. So wherever you can do it uninterrupted, feel relaxed and comfortable, and most important of all, where the Wi-Fi isn't going to go wrong.
There's been a couple questions about admissions test results,
Yeah.
which I get asked about quite a lot, and most people are surprised to hear that aside from the Bmat, you won't hear back until after the interview's done for pretty much everything. So I found out my TSA result after I found out if I had an offer. Often not very helpful from the student's perspective, because you know it's helpful to know how well you've done in order to have a sense of how well things are going, but you're just not going to know. So yeah, Bmat usually it's end of November or sort of around the 25th of November. Is that right this year, guys?
Yeah, so I think it's next Friday, 27th.
Okay. So that you will know. And someone asked if you hear back from Cambridge before or after the Bmat results. It'll vary. Some colleges are faster, some colleges are slower. And so I think things are also likely to be a little bit delayed given the issues that were had with the Bmat. Just in terms of offering interviews, because that might trickle down to them making their decisions as to who to interview.
Marvelous. Thanks for that. We've had a couple of questions about the interviews themselves. Do you have any particular tips for those? We've got a lot of questions asking for tips and strategies for preparation. Beyond our main rack of services, do you have any sort of big picture tips, Rohan or Will, you can share? I didn't get in my first interview. I'm not very much help on this score. I could only offer bad advice.
For those worried, don't worry. Matt did eventually make it to Oxbridge on the second try.
In terms of general interviews tips, like there's been lots of specific questions about different subjects. That's not really something, like we said earlier, we want to try and be as relevant for as many people as possible. But overall for interviews, just really make sure to pay attention and listen to what the tutor professor is actually saying. A lot of the time, you know, we say that these interview questions, they're not designed to trick you or trip you up. They'll often be trying to open up a dialogue for you to reach the answer. So, you know, as Matt said earlier, don't just sort of go down one line of thinking and stick to it stubbornly. Do listen to what they're saying. You know, as a psychologist, if you are given more information, new data, you need to then change your hypothesis conclusion accordingly. Don't just ignore it.
Yes.
My top tip really is the journey versus destination. So this is something I talk about with students quite a lot. It is just imagine that you're try and imagine that you're leading the interviewer on a journey instead of kind of just telling them the answer. So to give an example, if you were asked hypothetically how many ping pong balls can you fit in a 747 plane, the incorrect answer, even if the correct answer was say 10 million, the correct approach to do that is not just to say 10 million and then zip it for the next 1 minute and stare at each other in awkward silence. It's actually to talk them through the process of what assumptions you've made, such as, you know, for instance, you could say, well, the volume of a ping pong ball is this, I've calculated it using this formula, count the volume of the jumbo jet is this, the dead space is this, and then divide through and calculate the sum. So it's really about showing them each logical step of the journey rather than kind of just rushing in to the destination.
Yeah.
In terms of notice, so Theodore Awani has asked, how much notice will you get for an Oxford interview? We generally go off the rule of thumb of about 5 to 10 days for a UK student. That's like a pretty reliable amount of time that they give. Might be a little longer this year, given it's all online. Might be a little shorter this year, given that it's online. It's difficult to predict, really. But generally, what I recommend to students is, don't be sat there twiddling your thumbs while you're waiting for good or bad news to come through. Be proactive, do something with the time you have, because you'll have wished you had if you get an interview and you've got 5 days to get ready for it.
Fab, thanks. We've had a few questions about different exam systems and gap years and things. We're more than happy to provide help for students who are applying from outside the UK. So with the Abitur or the Baccalaureate or the whatever it's called in Italy, I can't remember off the top of my head, or the International Baccalaureate, the European Baccalaureate, all of them pretty much we can help with. It's particularly helpful for these. If you visit the Oxford and Cambridge websites, they'll have a long page on exam system equivalencies, which will tell you what kinds of grades they are expecting from you to be competitive for an application. And that's a really good resource for making sure that you're in the right ballpark. And much the same thing goes for students on gap years. If you're on a gap year, if you've taken a gap year, if you've already got your A-level results, obviously that can be an advantage in applying, and that's something we're more than happy to work with you on. If the typical offer for your subject is A-star AA, and you've already got A-star AA, then you don't have to worry about that. You just need to worry about getting the place. You don't have to worry about the exams anymore. So that can be a weight off the mind for a lot of people. And I can see, Rohan, you've pinged a question up as something you're interested in talking about just there.
There's a lot of them. Which one are you referring to in particular?
GCSEs. My child didn't do as well as he would have liked on his GCSEs, but performed exceptionally well at A-level.
So it depends on how badly they did in their GCSEs, and also depends on the reason. So we have worked with students who, to give some context, we work with students who got no A-stars at GCSE, and we've got them into Oxbridge. We've also worked with students who had straight A-stars at GCSE. So an A-star, by the way, is defined as an 8 or a 9.
We're very old-fashioned.
Yeah, and we've not got them in. So GCSE, as I said, an important part of the puzzle, but it's not sufficient on its own. If the student's done particularly poorly, so what I generally tend to say is less than 5 A-stars, 5 8s or 9s in the GCSEs, then we would have to look at what were the extenuating circumstances. Some students are late bloomers, so they do particularly well at A-level, in which case we can look at that together. Obviously, it will depend on the subject as well. So if you're thinking about medicine, for instance, unless there's some serious extenuating circumstances, unlikely. But some of the more humanities subjects, there's definitely possibilities there.
Yes, I mean, the thing to remember is the GCSEs are interesting because they're a prediction of how you will do on your A-levels. If you've already done your A-levels and you've done brilliantly in them, then it means the GCSEs weren't a particularly useful prediction. And they're going to be given lower weight as a consequence. We were talking, I think, last week with a student who had done poorly on his GCSEs because he had fractured a disc in his back and couldn't walk. Things like that, very good excuse.
It's also worth bearing in mind, if you don't have an excuse, then your GCSE profile would make a difference to what universities you might be applying to. Very relevant for medicine in particular, but also relevant between Oxford and Cambridge. It may be that you've got a much stronger profile for Cambridge than Oxford, or vice versa. And so important to bear that in mind.
Fantastic. I'm just going to run through a few of the shorter questions with shorter answers. Do we offer any help for theology applicants? Asked Oliver Dobbs. Yes, I believe we worked with a theology applicant last year. I don't have the graph in front of me at the moment, but that's definitely a subject we can offer support for. So that wouldn't be a problem at all. If you'd like to get in touch, we can arrange something on that front, I'm certain. Julia Wozniak asked about the issue with the Bmats. So the understanding we have at the moment is that because the computer system that was used to distribute the Bmat test didn't have sufficient bandwidth to distribute it stably over certain levels of network connection, it meant that for some people, some of the pictures didn't load quickly enough. And so you'd end up trying to do 20 questions in half the time, as you spent half the time sitting there waiting for them to load, and problems of that ilk. So we don't know the full extent of this, but what we do know is that the students we've spoken to, something went wrong for, I believe, something in the region of half of them. And so what impact that's going to have on the Bmats, we don't know for certain, but definitely given that a lot of people have had problems, a lot of people are going to have adjustments made on that basis in the case of the Bmat. Theodore Awani asks, how do the enrichment sessions benefit a law interview for Oxford, considering the interview is based on material provided on the day? And we had another question about preparing for the Cambridge law test. I wanted to address these. These are kind of a common misconception about preparation, I think, which is that people say, oh, well, if I'm going to be asked about this particular topic without knowing about it ahead of time, is it worth preparing at all? And the way I like to think of this is if you would imagine that you worked in, say, a restaurant and you had never cooked a crocodile before, for example, you wouldn't say that because you had never cooked a crocodile before, your experience cooking fish or beef or chicken was unhelpful. You would say that all of those knife skills, all of that preparation, all of that understanding of temperature and flavor and seasoning and all those things would be applicable to a whole range of things. So that even if you had never worked with the particular meat, all of those skills would still be relevant. And I think that's the case here. It'll be a document you haven't seen before, but the skills you need to interpret that, you need to practice those ahead of time, regardless of what you end up being put in front of you in the interview. We really focus on preparing people on a skills basis rather than on a knowledge basis. We want to give them the tools to succeed, not the answers, because if the questions turn out to be different questions, then the answers are no good. But if they've got the tools to answer any question because we've given them the right equipment, then that solves that problem. I hope that helps, Theodore. I realise that was a long and somewhat poorly structured answer, which I don't think would have done well in the law interview, which just goes to show why I'm not a lawyer.
But it's also another point on that, Matt, is it's worth saying that you know that it's not a quiz, it's not a test of how much stuff you've learned. But if you go into an interview for any subject at Oxford or Cambridge, and they go past the specific questions that I wanted to ask you, they've gone through the main body of it, and they ask you some kind of question which is about your interest in the subject area, and you don't really have anything to tell them about it, that's a really bad sign to an Oxford tutor. To give you an example, there's been from PPE, there was one year where the politics interview went really well, the philosophy interview went really well, and then the economics tutor asked them about, I think it was something like the most recent budget, and the student just had no idea. And from the tutor's perspective, how can you genuinely be saying you are an interested and active and good PPE applicant if you have no idea about arguably the most important thing that was going on at the time for that kind of thing? So if you've shown no interest in your subject and they ask you about it and you have nothing to tell them, then that's going to put you in a pretty weak position.
Thanks, Will. We've got another question about the Bmat situation. One of our attendees asks, half of the students who took the Bmat or half of the students you've spoken to? Now, I haven't looked at the data this morning, but my understanding is we spoke to over 200 students who had taken the Bmat, and something of the order of 100 of them had had a problem. And I can't remember this particular part of my statistics course, but I believe that with that larger sample and that level, we're very firmly in the 95% confidence interval that somewhere between 30 and 60% of people had a problem. So it is students we've spoken to, but we're very confident. Here we are. Shivang says that around 25% of the Bmat candidates experience difficulties. That's what she's heard. So there you go. That's certainly a significant number of them.
So there's a few questions on, do we have any tips specific for PPE interviews or medicine interviews? So we've kind of gone through the most common piece of advice. Subject specific wise, obviously it really depends on the details. And there's also a few questions on things like, what are my chances of getting in? It's very hard for us to answer these questions just because we normally need to ask about 15, 20 questions to kind of really get a better understanding of your application. So for instance, just because you've got 9 A stars or 9 9s at GCSE doesn't guarantee you an interview would need to ask a lot more information. So the best way to do that really is to book a consult, which is what Matt's showing you through the slides right now. But please keep your questions coming in.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rohan. We've had a couple of questions here about what you should wear, which is a famous topic. I remember it being a big source of anxiety when I applied. I think a shirt is a perfectly good idea for a boy. I wouldn't worry too much about wearing a tie. I think Will is dressed perfectly acceptably. Rohan as well.
Thank you.
I think they both look fine. It's one of those things people worry, I think, perhaps too much about. But yeah, as long as you look tidy. I believe the official advice from Cambridge this year on their website was not as if you're going to a nightclub, not as if you're going to the gym, but something in between, and you should be fine. So yes, just neat and tidy, but it's not. You're not going to be judged on that basis, so it's not worth worrying too much about.
Yeah, often as well, your dress code is as much for you as it is for them. You know, when we used to do exams at school, I would always do them in sort of uniform, school uniform, rather than in trackies. And that's just because it's about a mindset kind of thing rather than anything else. And, you know, lots of people want to be comfortable, but actually you want to be in an academic mindset. If trackies does that for you, fine. But, you know, I certainly feel more academic in something like a shirt, maybe even a tie. But again, it's just what you're used to.
Yes, if like me, you didn't go to a school with ties, I wouldn't recommend starting to get into them now. But if you did, then, you know, stick with what you're comfortable with. We've had a couple of questions about history and English from one of the attendees. If you can drop us an email, that would be really helpful, because I suspect your questions have relatively subtle answers that I can find out, but not during the middle of the presentation. So if you book a consultation through the system in the picture that is hopefully looping, but doesn't seem to be working brilliantly, which is frustrating.
I think it's going.
Or if you drop us an email, info@uniadmissions.co.uk, any detailed or subtle or specific questions I can try and answer. So if you want to know specific things about the weight of coursework in an application for a particular subject, I might be able to find out the answer, but it'll take me a couple of hours, and I certainly won't be able to do it while we're still on the call. So do get in touch directly, and I will try and help then when I've got more time and sort of space to do it. So we've got further questions about interview tips, from sort of going to leave to one side. Another question about approaching the interview: is it better to be standing or sitting while interviewing? I have not had this question before. I've not tried doing it standing. If you've got one of those fancy standing desks that were fashionable a few years ago, you could give it a go. But as we said with the outfits, the trick is to feel relaxed and comfortable. And I struggle to believe most people would feel comfortable standing up. If that's your thing, you know, there's no reason to say you couldn't do it cross-legged on the floor or kneeling down or however you like. But my guess would be for most people, sitting is going to be the most natural position, and I would recommend doing whatever feels most natural to you. We had some detailed questions as well from Alison about applying for English. Again, if you can get in touch directly, I'll be able to give you a more direct answer on that, because I unfortunately do not know anything specific about English at Oxford at Worcester off the top of my head, but it's something I can definitely look into. One question that's come in is, will there be more interviews this year given the process has gone online? We don't know, and obviously we won't know until afterwards, because there isn't a broadcast or publication of the number of students being interviewed ahead of time. Our guess would be that there might be. Obviously, the logistical challenges of moving around young people, putting them in and out of rooms, getting them some lunch, all those things have been got rid of by the online interview process. So my guess would be that there might be more interviews than normal, but we unfortunately won't know probably until May, at which point it won't be very helpful information.
On the other hand, Matt, as well, you know, getting students in and out of lunch is something that the colleges have been doing for 400 or 500 years. Right. Doing Zoom interviews for absolutely everyone is going to be brand new. So it may be that there's actually more disruption this year than normal.
That's a very good point. I think very helpful in terms of being ready for the technology. Chances are you're going to be better with the technology than the interviewer is. So it's a good opportunity to look slick and well prepared while they may be struggling, particularly if you're one of their first interviews. But unfortunately, we simply don't know about the number of interviews, but it could go either way. Our guess is that there may be slightly more, but not so many more that it's going to have an impact on your chances, we shouldn't think. We've also had questions about the experience and background of our tutors. I know, Rohan, you're quite heavily involved in recruiting them and being nice to them. Can you tell us a little bit about where you find them?
Yeah, our tutors are all Oxbridge current students or graduates, in case of the medics, and lots of them are actually practicing doctors. Essentially, we have to work very closely with our tutor pool to ensure that they understand what required from the Oxbridge admissions process. A lot of our, and sometimes parents say, well, why can't I have someone who's got a PhD and has been tutoring for 15 years? We purposefully use recent graduates or undergraduates because they've gone through the process very recently. So if you think about something like the admissions tests, some of these admissions tests like the NSAA, ENGA and so on, they didn't exist 6 years ago. So if you've got a tutor who's not even sat the test, how on earth can you expect them to actually go and teach your child about it? And it's a very similar thing with the interviews. So if you have someone from a couple of generations ago, perhaps who was, as we talked about right at the start, asked questions like, why are bananas straight or not straight? Those kind of questions are becoming less and less common. So the style and the difficulty of the mock interviews won't be relevant or as applicable than if they're actually delivered by undergrads. And actually, the feedback we get from our students is some of them have gone on and actually have been asked some very, very similar questions. And it's no secret that Oxbridge, the admissions tutors do recycle questions now. So it's not unheard of for students to walk in actually having gone through a similar interview in the past. So the tutors are actually, the new ones are actually in the best position possible to ensure that your child gets the closest experience to the real thing.
Fantastic, thanks, Rohan. We've had a couple of questions about still staying on the interview itself. Katerina Klotz asked, is it better to answer with strong claims showing your personality, or is it better to be careful and not necessarily show your own view in the interview? I don't know how you both feel. I think the thing to remember here, Katerina, and this goes for everyone, is that the interview is an opportunity for you to show them that you're smart enough, but also to show them that you're interesting and pleasant and fun and they want to work with you. By making an offer to you, they're committing to spending 3, 4, maybe even more years working with you in seminars and supervisions, reading your essays, marking them, doing all of these things. And they want to know what you're like, what you're interested in, what you're passionate about, and what kind of person you are to work with. So I would very much say, if you have a strong opinion, you're passionate about something, you have a particular, strong opinion about a particular subject, you should really make sure to put that across, because as long as your arguments are well reasoned and interesting, it won't count against you, even if the interviewer disagrees with you.
Yeah. So pay particular attention to that last thing that Matt said. It's very much, Oxford and Cambridge are very academic, very empirical. They want it to be based on something. If you just have a lot of preformed, crystallized ideas about various things, that's not really what they're looking for. They're looking for people who can develop conclusions and arguments based on the evidence. So if you're going to say something, say it, but make sure that you've got reasons for it and a good explanation behind it. Else it looks like you've just developed some standpoints for no reason.
Yeah, the other thing to remember here, and this is a mistake that a lot of students I've worked with over the years have made, is that they think that showing their potential and their skill and their intelligence means a certain kind of showing off. And the thing to remember is you want to go to Oxford to learn things, not because you already know things. And so in the interview, you want to be showing that you know some things, but that you are open to new experiences, new ideas, new information, and that you want to incorporate those things. If you're unwilling to be flexible, if you use the interview as an opportunity to make a big speech about how clever you are and show off, it's not a very good demonstration of why they should want you on the course. Because if the message you're giving is, I have nothing to learn from you, I'm already too clever for this university, well, there's no reason for them to take you then, is there? You know, you want to be showing that you're a good student, not a good teacher in the interview. And so strong opinions are an excellent idea, but at the same time, you want to be ready to adjust your opinions, show evidence, get into a debate and have a little bit of back and forth. You don't want to be dogmatic or stubborn. It's a tricky balance to strike. And that's why we like to spend so long with our students in the enrichment seminars and other things, introducing them to new and challenging ideas so they can be more skilled in this kind of thinking, as it's something I was frankly terrible at when I was 17. And no doubt a contributing factor for it taking me 2 attempts to get in.
We've got a question about, given that there's only a couple weeks notice, you know, what is the benefit, the value of preparing? Should you just sort of not do anything? Now, the short answer to that is you should have started preparing long in advance of getting your invitation. You know, we've said this a couple of times, it's not really sensible to just be waiting, doing nothing. You know, only in only if you haven't planned ahead should you be in the situation where you only have 1 or 2 weeks left. But even if you do get to that situation, you know, it's certainly different to something like the admissions test, where there is a bit more of a ability to be able to sort of cram things. You can't do that as much with the interviews. You can still make quite a big difference. You know, the question is sort of talking about how naturally good you are at certain things. You're not really naturally good at many things. Most things you have to learn, and most things you can improve. So it's certainly worth making the most of however much time you have to develop how well you're able to handle an academic interview. So yeah, obviously some students will tell me, I'm just going to sort of let it happen and see how it goes. That's fine, you know, by all means. But if you want to have the best chance of getting an offer, then certainly putting work into it is worth it.
And you know, just on that note, regardless of whether you work with us or someone else, or you know, don't work with us, please make sure your child starts preparing for their interviews now. If they haven't already, I mean, it's better to be late than never. So you know, things like basic stuff like grab an Oxford interview list of questions for the subject. Just ask your child how they would respond to each of them, and actually, at the start, they'll really struggle. But actually, hopefully, after the 50th question, they should have a feel of how to actually approach each of these options, and that's really vital, is getting them used to the feeling of interview. Unlike what people say, you can't just wing these interviews. You do need to prepare for them.
Thanks, Rohan. In the words of Confucius, when is the best time to plant a tree? 100 years ago. When is the second best time to plant a tree? Today. Max Proietti asks, when an interviewer asks the question, have you got any questions? How should I answer? So this was something I discussed with our students this morning. And my answer, well, I don't know if you guys will agree, is that you should ask them a question you want to know the answer to, and that you don't know the answer to already. So it may be that you want to ask their opinion of something you've been discussing. It may be that you want to ask a question that you're simply curious about that you hope they'll know. But the thing I would really guard against is trying to ask a question that you already know the answer to, as if you're testing them, or coming up with something sort of boring and, you know, tired. I think the thing to think of is you may not, if you may not have the opportunity to speak to an Oxford academic again. Think about what you would genuinely like to know from them that you're not going to be able to find out from anywhere else, and ask them that question. That'll mean that you're leaving the interview having found something out and having left them with the impression that you want to give, which is that you want to work with them, that you're interested in what they have to say, that you're open and curious, and hopefully you'll learn something, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And
I always, in all walks of life, I guard against asking questions that you don't want to know the answer to.
Just on that note, actually, we've had a few instances which I've kind of come across, where students do an excessive amount of research on their interviews. So it's important to kind of obviously look your interviews up, understand what their main specialties are, but please don't go reading too much into the details of their papers and publications and then try and come up with obtuse and intricate questions. It doesn't make you look more interested. It just can come across as, especially if you don't understand their topic as well, it can actually be more harmful. So avoid the urge to kind of go into too much detail on that front.
Rohan's right. The way to think of it, I like to think, is if you were going on a date with someone. If you were going on a first date with someone, you wouldn't ask them the question about their brother, because you might not know they had a brother yet, and it may not come across well that you've been doing such detailed research into their background. I think that's the way to think of it. You want to give a good impression, and that is a mix of seeming interesting and curious and making sure that you don't seem sort of toadying and creepy. A couple of questions people have asked about the virus and whether there'll be questions about the virus in interviews. Obviously, I can't speak to every interview. I don't know if it will come up in every interview. I would be amazed if no one asked a question about the virus. Just as a couple of years ago, we were being asked about Brexit. Did some people get asked about Brexit? Yes. Did everyone get asked about Brexit? No. Did someone get asked about Brexit? Loads of people. So I think it's a good idea to have some interesting ideas about the virus, but we can't guarantee it'll come up, but I would be amazed if it didn't. So it's certainly worth, even as an intellectual exercise, thinking about the angle on the virus from your subject. So Oliver Dobbs asks about the virus in the context of theology. So you might want to think about why it is that churches at present are closed, whereas supermarkets are not, and the different standards that religion is held to in different societies around the world, how those things have changed over time, and how the specific nature of the virus impacts those decisions at the public health and the kind of cultural level, just as an example.
And don't forget, sometimes we think of these interviews as an interrogation. They aren't always in that format. So often they'll ask you something fairly broad, like, what have you read recently? Or is there anything that you're really interested in? And actually, your response to that can actually dictate the flow of the interview. So in my interview, I was asked about what I'd read recently. We ended up having a really good discussion about statins. If you're really interested by COVID, it's a good chance to bring it up. So if you're applying for biological natural sciences or medicine, and you're genuinely interested in the creation of a vaccine, then bring that up. And, your interviewers will be able to have a detailed conversation with you.
Yes, I mean, it's unlikely, but you may be lucky enough to be interviewed by one of the people working on the vaccine, in which case I'm sure they'll be flattered by your questions. But you may find yourself going down a rabbit hole of far too much detail if you're not careful. But certainly if you're going to talk about the virus, you want to make sure you know what the difference between DNA, RNA and mRNA is. I don't know what the difference is, but I've seen all of them in the news, so I'm sure it's important.
While we're on the virus, actually, someone's asked about the effects of last year's excess places for next year. Technically speaking, there should be no difference because Oxford and Cambridge said to students, you're not allowed to defer if it's just because of the virus. And they also made additional space for all the additional students that sort of joined this last year, because they had to give more offers, given that everyone met their, everyone got their predictions. So there shouldn't be any difference really on that front. Yeah, generally the spaces should be the same, unless, Matt, you have something new?
No. This was something we were very worried about back in September. Universities have worked really hard to sort out this problem. Cambridge in particular, I've heard stories of junior academics being turfed out of their offices to turn them into dorm rooms and so on and so forth. And I know that Cambridge has bought up quite a lot of real estate around the Cowley Road. Now, that's in Oxford.
That is Oxford, yeah.
Yes, sorry, I'm thinking of Mill Road. They've bought up quite a few flats and houses to make sure they've got enough accommodation and all those sorts of things sorted out. So the universities have been really admirably proactive. We've had quite a few questions about GCSE scores and Bmat scores. The best thing for these is to get in touch with us directly in a consultation, for the reason, as I said earlier, I can't get all of these spreadsheets out while I'm on the while I'm doing this presentation. And so I can't do the answers right now, but they are very easy once we're on the phone to get up in front of us. So if you want to get in touch with questions about Bmat marks and GCSEs and things of that nature, please get in touch directly, because all of that stuff is really much more valuable in context of your background, of your GCSEs, of what you want to do. All those sorts of things have to be taken as a whole. Plus, we can't get to the spreadsheets while I've got the presentation going. So both high-tech and low-tech reasons to get in touch directly. We had a question about topics outside of what you mentioned in the supplementary admissions questionnaire for Cambridge. Often they will start you off with questions about your SAQ and your personal statement, but don't expect it to stay there. Things will move on. It will depend on the subject. Humanities subjects, you're likely to spend longer on the personal statement and the submitted work and the things you've said you're interested in, but you should be prepared to move off those topics as well. So the big piece of advice I would say is make sure that you have read all the books you said you had in your personal statement, that you've read through it, that you're comfortable discussing all those topics. Other topics will come up, but it's an easy mistake to make to not have revised your personal statement closely enough and get caught out by what is supposed to be an easy question. Let's see, we're coming down to the last few questions now. We've been on for exactly 90 minutes. So if you have any further questions, please do get them in, because my voice is starting to crack. And so I'm not sure we can hang around for a huge amount longer, and I'm going to try to get through as many of these as we can. We've had a question about the success calculator, where an applicant has had a less positive result than they were expecting from that. Again, to an even greater extent, without the algorithm itself in front of me, I can't tell you why those factors have led to that result, but it's something I can investigate, and please get in touch directly when we'll have a look. It's possible that the particular information you've given is weighted by the algorithm in a slightly perverse way, in which case I can correct it, but it's quite complicated, and so the reasons it comes out with things aren't always answers I can provide this quickly.
You've also, I mean, what some people don't realize as well is having straight 9s or A stars is usually pretty average for some of the courses. So, you know, lots of people come to me and say, I've got 6 9s and 2 8s and 2 7s. And that will be below average for certain courses, you know, even though there's a lot of A stars in there. Obviously, at this stage, you know, entering in just your GCSE and your A-level information and a few other things as well, it doesn't take into account things like the admissions test score, but basically it will just compare your profile to lots and lots of other students with the same profile. And there will be a lot of them because this is Oxford and Cambridge and the competition is very high.
Yeah, I mean, the purpose of these tests, the reason they were brought in the first place is because you couldn't tell the difference between all the students who had done well at A-level. Yeah. And you need to invent some other mechanism for telling them apart. Oliver Dobbs asked, do you think, based on your customers, that there'll be more people reapplying to university because of the virus, that competition will be higher either this year or next year? So we know that the number of people applying this year has gone up. Was it 14%, Rohan? I can't remember, 14%. Now that's for both Oxbridge and medical school, and we don't get disaggregated data for that until later in the year. My guess is that most of that bump is people deciding they would like to be a doctor, because honestly, if you haven't been motivated into being a doctor by the events of the last 9 months, I don't know what could motivate you. There's probably been a small uptick in terms of Oxbridge applications as well, but obviously we're double counting there, medicine and Oxbridge for Oxbridge medicine, and we would have expected 3 or 4% growth in applications to Oxford and Cambridge anyway. So my guess is there may have been a slightly above trend increase, but honestly, nothing that you're going to notice at the application level as an individual. It's something that'll show up when I do a graph of 4,000 people, not something when you do an experience of 1 person.
It's also worth being aware that for the, you know, this imaginary person who's reapplying this year and thus making things more competitive, they would have to have had an offer from Oxford and Cambridge for this year, rejected it, to then try again this year. And I don't know many people who are confident enough to do something like that. You know, most people will, if they get the offer, take it very gratefully. For lots of other universities, it's more likely. I think for Oxford and Cambridge, it's less likely, because I think people will, what you got to remember is they would have found out they had an offer in January, and then in February, March, lockdown happened, and then they were guaranteed their grades. So for an Oxford applicant, that's like almost the ideal scenario. You get your offer and you know that you're going to get a place with it. So there's not going to be this like a overwhelming horde of people reapplying this year. There will be the same number, maybe a bit higher than any other time, really.
Fantastic. Thanks, Will. Katharina asks whether EU students have better or worse chances this year than previous years. EU students are assessed on the same basis as everyone else. It's only for medicine that there is a cap on the number of non-UK students who can get places. Everything else, you're all assessed in one big old group, and where you come from has no impact. In medicine, there is a cap on the number of international students, but that's a decision by central government, one we're not particularly keen on, but unfortunately not something we can do anything about. But Rohan, you're the expert on this one when it comes to the frustrating rule around international medicine applications.
Yeah, the GMC imposed these limits. There's very little that even each university can do. So essentially, if you're applying as an international, it won't be harder for you unless you're applying as an international for medicine, in which case, yes, it will be much, much harder.
I wanted to ask as well, actually, do we know if the GMC is changing the limit because of the new European cohort?
Currently, we don't, there's no limits increase planned.
So there you go. Not brilliant news if you're applying for medicine, but not a problem for everything else. There are a couple of further questions about international students and medicine to do with scholarships and things like these. Again, this is something where it's really worth getting in touch with us directly so that we can speak to your specific situation. As unfortunately, we can't give, well, I mean, we can give generic advice. Unfortunately, it's not very good. If you want advice that's going to be really helpful, we'll have to speak to you directly so that we can understand your circumstances and give you a really clear, nuanced bit of information. Anonymous attendee says that 15,000 students sat the Bmat this year. Is this more than last year? Off the top of my head, no. I think that's roughly the same number, give or take a couple of thousand. But obviously 15,000 is a rounded number, or a surprise that it was such a tidy number. So I don't know. From memory, I think it was something like 1,600, 1,650 last year. So that would suggest it's more or less flat. But that's something I'll look into. And if you want to get in touch directly, I should have an answer for you in more detail sometime next week, once I've looked into that with the Bmat, with Cambridge Assessment. But 15,000 is roughly the same number as last year from what I can remember. But again, I'll have to check. Unless you remember differently, Rohan.
It's very similar. So last year there were 10,500 that sat in October and 2,000 that sat in September. So about 12,500. This year has gone up a little bit, but more universities are using the Bmat. So it is a relative increase, but not one that you should really be concerned about at the individual level.
No. We have a question. If you were asked about yourself, would you talk about your background or personality or skills or experience or all of them? I think all of those are good things to talk about. Again, you want to be making sure that in your presentation, you're putting forward reasons for them to want to work with you in an academic context. So again, it's like the difference between the destination and the journey Rohan was talking about earlier. If you can tell them a story about how your experiences, your personality, your circumstances have all come together to sort of bring you to this point and make you a wonderful applicant, then that's going to be a really good story to tell. If you get bogged down in some sort of story about what happened to you when you were 8 or 9 years old that doesn't really go anywhere, you don't want to do that. But if you want to put things, forward about yourself, then the trick is to make sure the story you're telling reinforces the message that you're, a fun, interesting, curious, intelligent person. And I think we've got 3 questions left. If anyone hasn't asked a question and would like to slip one in, we'll probably do another 3 or 4 minutes. So this is your last chance. Otherwise, I think we're going to go home. So one attendee asks if you were asked why Cambridge, what would you say? Rohan, why Cambridge? Why did you want to go to Cambridge?
So for me, it was very personal. It was because Cambridge was #1 university for medicine. Back when I applied, it has been for a while that way. But more importantly, it wasn't, and you know, I think lots of students forget this. The reason Oxford do so well in general and are able to produce such high academic work year after year in pretty much every field is because, unlike most of the universities, you have very small group teaching. So some of my subjects like anatomy, physiology, I had almost 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 teaching from essentially leading experts and professors. Nowhere else in the world do you get that, and that happens on a weekly basis. So in my second year, I used to have 7 or 8 of these sessions per week. Obviously, that creates a lot of work, but the ability to be taught and not just kind of be lectured at and talked to death by PowerPoint, that's what makes Oxbridge really special. And that's actually what I talked about in my interviews, is the fact that I was looking forward to, and you know, that's why I wanted to study there, so that I could be taught by the world experts and actually ask them questions in a one-to-one or a small group setting. That's what made Cambridge so special for me.
There you go. Obviously, don't say exactly that because they'll know that was Rohan, but something along those lines. I'm going to just do these last 2. We're also asked, will you be asked why you chose your specific college? Generally speaking, no. They won't ask you a question like that. If they do, it will just be as a way of a piece of small talk to warm you up into the interview. Obviously, it's a good idea to know why you want to go to that college, but they're not expecting you to have a really specific, deep reason about, you know, a famous alumnus or a special building or anything like that. It's good to know why you want to go there, but ultimately, you're not going to be given a chance to go or not go based on that alone. So we've got, and yeah, another question about different colleges. So Cambridge will move applicants around after the interview stage. So on the whole, there's no college that is harder or easier to get into than any other. So I wouldn't worry too much about that when you're coming to apply, whether it's to Christ's or Trinity or wherever. So just to finish off, Sashi Gwalani asks, what would be a good medical question to ask at the end, which is where we are. And we have been asked, why are bananas straight? And I've looked it up, and it turns out bananas are curved so that because they move towards the sun. It's I think something like called a geotropic effect. But I had to look that up, so hopefully that won't come up in my interview. But Rohan, if you can finish us off with what would be a good medical question to ask in the end. Phototropic, see, that's why I didn't get in.
Yeah, geotropic is for roots, isn't it? When they go down rather than up.
There you go. See, that's why I didn't get in. In fact, we've even had a suggestion of a good medical question. How would you estimate how much blood is there in the human body, Rohan?
Oh, what a great question. There's so many ways. We actually do a whole tutorial on this in one of the seminars. There's lots and lots of ways you could do it, depending on how much equipment you have access to. So if you're going kind of the high-tech route, you could just kind of put a radioactive tracer in, measure the frequency and the dilution of how often it comes across when you take samples. You want to do it really, really simply. And actually, one of my peers actually got asked this in his interview. Well, you can just take a certain amount of blood out of someone and then see the drop in pressure. Obviously, there are compensatory mechanisms. So realistically, you'd have to do that in a very quick setting. But there are loads and loads of ways to accomplish it.
There you go. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend attempting the method I had thought of, which is to put a hole in a person, take all the blood out, check how much there is, and then put it back in again.
As long as they're dead, I suppose that's fine.
It would work. You would know how much blood was in their body. So
yes, I suppose so. Risha has asked for a little bit of clarification on the pool system. So if you could just fill that in, Rohan, and then that's it. That's the end.
So the pool system is different in Oxford and Cambridge. At Cambridge, essentially what happens is you're interviewed at the college that you applied for, and then depending on your interview scores and your test scores, you may get an offer, you may get rejected, or the third option is you may get pulled, in which case they think, actually, you were pretty good, but not quite good enough, or not potentially a good fit for this college that you've applied to. However, we think you're still Cambridge material and could be a good fit for another college. In that case, one of the other colleges will pick you up. They may then make you an offer straight away based on the information they have available, or in more likelihood, they'll ask you to come and have another set of interviews. And actually that process can happen twice. So in theory, I've known students to actually be interviewed at 3 different colleges in some extreme circumstances. The vast majority are interviewed at 1, a small minority at 2 though. But essentially what that allows them to do is to go through the interview process and ensure that anyone who's good enough and has just potentially picked a college that's more competitive isn't disadvantaged.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Rohan, for clarifying that. So that is, we've done 120 questions, which I believe is a record.
Not bad.
And terrifyingly, we have managed to keep on 70 people for the entire 1 hour, 45-minute duration of this call, which is nearly, I mean, that's longer than almost every children's film, longer than the film Psycho. You know, the things you could have been doing with your time that would have been more interesting than this, they are numerous and vast, which is all the more flattering, because I would certainly rather have been doing those than doing one of these, although that's probably because this is the 5th I've done recently, so maybe I'm just worn down. So for those of you who are still here who are thinking of booking a consultation with us, hopefully the graphic is still going round and round. If it's not, I'm sorry. That's because I haven't figured out how to make it work properly. Like I said, I've said it going again one last time. And also to be aware that we are doing this, more or less this presentation with a few tweaks again, this time next week. And that is the last time we're doing this one, because at that point, the interviews will be in full swing. And we will be switching our focus to students who will be joining us in December and January to apply in October of 2021. So if you want to join us on the 5th, now if I can cycle back through these slides quickly, I can ping up the detail, which is that we'll be doing another one of these for students applying in 2021 and beyond on Saturday the 5th, also at 2 o'clock, where I'll be doing a whole new PowerPoint presentation. So for those of you who are completists, you can come back then. But yes, more or less the same thing again next week for those who are doing interviews in the next couple of weeks. Otherwise, if you're looking further ahead, please join us on the 5th. And thanks very much for coming. It's been great. I'm now going to go off and make some supper before my wife gets home. I hope you've got lovely plans as well, Rohan. I know that your other half is asleep, Will.
Yeah, I don't know what I'll do.
Oh, apparently there's rugby on. God, if only I'd known.
All right, well, thank you both, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all for sticking around. If you still have more questions, I can see a couple still pinging away. I think we'll call it a day here, but please do book a consult with me and Will. We're both working this weekend and we'll be able to pick things up. So hopefully that graphic's not bored you to death, but if you're still not sure, www.uniadmissions.co.uk, and have a good afternoon and a good weekend otherwise.
Yeah,
Cheers.
thanks for coming, guys. Hope it was helpful.
See you both on Monday.